Hello and welcome to the bonus episode of Season 1. Technically, it's the 55th episode, and I say welcome to our long-term listeners. If you're just tuning in for the first time, oh my God, there's a huge library to help you build the practice and the life of your dreams. Make sure you go back and listen to all of those previous episodes. There is a wealth of knowledge there. But on today's episode, we're going to take the time to go through and talk about specific adjusting techniques to clear the spine properly to be sure you remove all of the vertebral subluxations. And yes, I know that may sound rudimentary. This episode was specifically recorded with the student in mind because as you go through school, as all of us did, we learn all of the different techniques and you learn which ones work better for you and which ones you seem to have more difficulty with and don't work quite as well for you. And that's just fine. But do you have a clean, clear, concise system with each patient each time you see them for optimum results? And as I said, this is a bonus episode. So what that means is this will be the final episode in Season 1. But don't get concerned. We've already got Season 2 queued up, recording those episodes. And I look forward to seeing you for Season 2 of For the Love of Chiropractic. But let's get started with this episode. Welcome to another episode of For the Love of Chiropractic. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Freeman. I've been in practice for over 30 years, and I continue to work in a $1 million practice that I built, ran, and sold. I've taught, lectured, and coached our profession, and helped so many chiropractors build the practice and the life of their dreams. And now, I want to help you do the same. So here's today's show. Today we're going to spend time talking about something that we just barely touched on in the very first episode of this podcast that was called The Patient Experience. In that episode, we talked about the overall patient experience. We talked about the different parts of the office very, very generally. And then in subsequent episodes, we went on and talked about the front desk, your director of first impressions. We also spent time talking about a great floor CA on another episode. But today, on today's episode, we're going to talk about something that really hits home. This one thing is arguably the most important thing that happens in your entire office. Of all the things that go on, this is the one thing. It's got to be done correctly. It's got to be done precisely, with precision, every time. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the chiropractic adjustment. Not just any one adjustment. The procedure that you go through to adjust a spine, to clear the spine, to make sure that you've removed all the subluxations so this person can leave your office in better functioning health capacity than when they came in, moving them closer and closer to optimum health. But before we start digging into that, the inspiration for this particular episode came from a conversation that I had with a great chiropractor who's also a private consulting client early one morning regarding the adjustment and how you clear a spine. And the story that I related back to him was regarding a commercial that I had seen during the Super Bowl several years ago. Standing there was the president of one of the largest banks in America. And he was standing in the check processing center. And it looked sort of like you would imagine the post office to look, or a very busy airport luggage processing place with lots of conveyor belts and ramps going up and down and left and right and diagonally across the screen. You could see all that behind him, and it was blurred out. And what this man said as he stood there in his beautiful suit, shirt, tie, looking very professional and speaking very exactly to the camera, he said, "As the president of the bank, we process over 1 million checks a day. And our job is not to get the vast majority of them processed correctly. Our job is to process one check perfectly and then repeat that 1 million times a day, day in and day out, because that's what we do for our customers. And if you're a chiropractic physician, your job is not to do the best adjustment you can for the majority of your patients. No, Our job is to do one perfect adjustment at a time for each person, for each segment of the spine that we're adjusting, clear the spine properly, send that person on their way, and then repeat that as many times as we choose to in a day, helping as many people as our technique will allow and our heart wants to serve. So now I want to get into the procedure, the nuts and bolts of one way to clear a spine. That's not to say that this is the only way. That's not to say this is the best way. This is what I have found to be the best way with my 30 plus years of practice. But if you have a way that works great, that's fine too. And I would love to hear about that. And I encourage you to reach out to the show via the website fortheloveofchiropractic.com. And I'd like to hear your procedure also. I think the procedure needs to be fast, efficient, logical, and have the patient squirming around on the table as little as possible. Because not only is that easier for the patient, safer for the patient, it also saves a little bit of time and becomes more efficient for both the office, the doctor, and the patient. And at this point, we're not going to discuss the patient coming into the room, the doctor coming into the room, them getting the things out of their pockets, getting them onto the table, the idle chit-chat that goes on, getting your subjective. We're going to be talking about the mechanics of clearing the spine. So once you've got the patient laying face down on the table and they're beginning to relax, what I recommend is a quick 5-10 second massage of their trapezius muscles, their rhomboid muscles, using your thumbs and the other palm and finger flexor muscles. The purpose of this is not to give a massage to the person. It's not to do trigger point therapy. It's simply to slow down, stop, connect your energy with the patient. Get on the same page they are. You're assessing the muscle tone, you're assessing the tautness, and if they're relaxed and ready to get adjusted. So with their arms positioned properly on the armrests, with their ankles not crossed, shoes on or off, I don't care. I like to begin by adjusting and clearing the thoracic spine, whether you use bilateral thenar, crossed piezoform, or whatever other technique you like. Take care of that first. Once you've cleared and adjusted the thoracic spine, palpate down through the lumbar spine, and check the movement of the sacroiliac joints. Do all that in one fell swoop. Do your leg length analysis, and then determine what your next procedure is going to be. If you're going to use a side posture technique, which side are you going to adjust first? If you're adjusting both sides of the sacroiliac joints with a side posture technique, I have found in my 30 plus years, the best way to do that is to adjust the long leg side first. You can do that very effectively with a side posture technique, having your piezoform on the ischial tuberosity and thrusting down along the shaft of the femur. That's your line of drive. That moves that side of the pelvis beautifully and efficiently. Have the person turn to the other side if you're adjusting both sacroiliac joints, doing both side postures, and then using a piezoform contact, go right onto the PSIS with the proper line of drive there. If the patient is somewhat more acute, drop technique works beautifully because you don't have to have them rolling from side to side when they're in acute pain like that. If they're even more acute than that, there's a beautiful technique that I have taught many chiropractors using SOT blocks along with manual flexion distraction. When I say manual flexion distraction, I mean a table that's not motorized. The table is set up to do flexion distraction where you're checking and moving the depth and speed of the table by hand. It's not motorized. So the way this is done is you place the sacrooccipital blocks, the SOT blocks, under the pelvis on the long leg side, place the block under the ASIS, and on the short leg side, place it at the level of the greater trochanter. The blocks should be placed diagonally so they're facing each other, and that position should give the person immediate relief, and they should say, oh yeah, that feels better. Not, I can tolerate it. Not, it's sort of comfortable. When you have those blocks placed correctly, immediately you've begun to neutralize the imbalance in the pelvis, and they go, oh, that's better. You've also made sure that the patient is positioned properly on the table so that their L5 is right at the level of the hinge of the flexion distraction table. I recommend taking a contact with one hand, a palmar contact, up high by the thoracolumbar junction, and with your other hand on the handle or even the foot piece of the table if you're tall enough with long enough arms, then to slowly lower the table into the flexion distraction position. Slowly and not deep. Hold it and bring it back up. The more acute the person is, the more slow you'll use the pumping maneuver on the table, and the more acute they are, the more shallow and longer holds they will be. Each of those holds should be 3 to 5 seconds, and I recommend doing between 5 and 10 of them. You can progressively bring your palmar contact that's up at the thoracolumbar junction progressively lower until you get down to the exact level of lumbar issue, and it's going to be very tender and acute. So go very slow, very gentle. As you do that, those SOT blocks may shift around and slide a little bit. As long as it's only a little bit, that's just fine. Obviously, if one drops out, that's a problem and it needs to be replaced. Once that has been done and the table's been locked and the blocks are still in place, you can then use an SI cross technique opposite from where those blocks are to help shift the pelvis back even more back to its normal biomechanical position, which is going to feel incredibly good when you lean on the patient on those opposite corners, and they're going to say it feels just terrific as your pressure's on there. And when I do that, I use almost my entire body weight, and I weigh about 200 pounds. But it's a slow, progressive, increasing pressure. It's not a drop all at once. But now going back to the patient who is not in acute pain, you've adjusted the pelvis and the lumbar spine as it needs to be bilaterally, and you ask them to go ahead and turn face up. Once they're resting comfortably supine on the table, you can ask the patient to take and interlace their fingers so that their palms are resting comfortably on their chest. Also glance down to make sure that their ankles are not crossed, because if their ankles are crossed or they're letting their arms hang down, it actually creates increased muscular tension, and it's much more difficult to do the adjustment. By having the ankles uncrossed and the hands resting comfortably on their chest, it relaxes the muscle tension and therefore easier to do the adjustment. So now you're going to palpate the cervical spine, and if you've been in practice for any period of time, you can easily go through and palpate the cervical pillars, checking the range of motion and the joint play at each of the 7 levels of the cervical spine. And I have found in my experience, most people are easy to adjust. You've palpated, they easily adjust, cavitate, the adjustment goes beautifully, and there's no problem at all. But sometimes we're working with a patient that can't relax. The muscles are tighter than they should be. They just can't let you turn the head to the side and do the rotation and get them set up the way they need to be. One of the most common things that's done in our profession, and I hate this, is the whole let me sneak up on you idea. Wiggle your toes, wiggle your fingers, and you're going to sneak up on the person and get the adjustment done. And that works. But it doesn't seem fair and honest. The procedure that I like much, much better, and it works beautifully all the times that I've done it, over 30 plus years. For those people that are more difficult to adjust, you get all lined up if you're doing diversified technique or palmar package. You get all lined up with your contact the way that it needs to be. And instead of doing the wiggle your toes, if you're doing an adjustment on the left side of the cervical spine, so their head is rotated somewhat to the right, ask them to turn their head to the right side a little bit further. Just go ahead and turn your head slightly, and as they do, adjust with them. You're not sneaking up on them. They're activating and moving their muscles to go in that direction, and the adjustment goes beautifully. I'm going to challenge you to try that with your next few patients, and what you're going to find is it works so much easier. Also, the beauty of doing the technique that way is you're not waiting to catch them off guard. They're actively trying to go the same way that you want to go, so you're in the flow with them. The next thing to do is if there are any anteriority adjustments that need to be done, the person is laying on the table, on their back. You can slip your hand underneath their spine, do what you need to with their arms, and adjust those anteriorities. Congratulations, you've now cleared the spine in a fast, clean, efficient manner. There's a wonderful trick to make sure you really have removed all of the subluxations. The trick, and it's not really a trick, it's a practice tidbit that comes from basic anatomy, is gently cup their suboccipital region and do a very slight gentle traction, holding it, not a pumping maneuver, and hold it. And you can ask them where they feel it. The patient will say that they feel it pulling just a little bit down in their lumbar spine, right at the lumbosacral junction. Now, they're not going to say lumbosacral junction. They'll say down at their belt line or down at the very, very base of their spine. But the reason that tells you that you truly have cleared their spine is because the dura is only attached up at the occiput in C1 and all the way down at the sacral base. If you have not cleared the spine, they'll feel a pulling or an achiness somewhere else along the way. Maybe it's T8, maybe it's T5, maybe it's L1. Wherever it is, that tells you it's still getting hitched at that point where the nerve root is traveling out through the IVF, the intervertebral foramina. Now, from an efficiency standpoint, once you have done that, start down at the toes and work your way back up to the hips if there's any of those other regions that need to be adjusted. Toes, feet, ankles, knees, even the hips. Work your way back up proximally. Once you've cleared that, if that needed to be done, place one hand under their cervical spine, offer your other hand to them, and say, let's go ahead and sit up and help them up. We're not jerking them up. We're not pulling them up quickly. We're just helping them sit back up while we're supporting their cervical spine properly. But again, obviously, if it's the more acute patient, you have them turn to their side where they swing their legs off as they push themselves up, and you can help very gently. Then they're using their body more like a seesaw, which takes most of the stress off of that lumbosacral junction and the rest of the spine. Now that the person is sitting up comfortably, now we start with the upper extremities. Any adjustments that need to be done on the fingers, the hands, the wrist, the elbows, all the way up to the shoulders, including the collarbones. I'd like to take a moment now to discuss the evaluation of the clavicles and the glenohumeral joints, so the shoulder girdle. With the patient still seated, if you take and place your hands with your thumbs right on the SC joints, your first three fingers, two or three fingers, on the clavicles, and then your ring finger and or pinkies all the way out at the edge of the AC joints. You then ask the person, as they're sitting up nice and straight, to abduct their arms to 90 degrees, so straight out. And you'll feel if there's any grinding or crepitus. And then have them turn so their palms up. And again, you're going to feel for crepitus. Then you'll ask them to reach all the way overhead, like it's a stick up, reach way up high. And again, feeling for crepitus. And then have them bring their hands down directly in front and tell them to try and touch your shoulders because you're down at their level. And again, you'll feel any aberrant motion. And then based on where you felt the aberrant motion, go through and adjust the glenohumeral joints. And that should help if you repeat that procedure. But in most cases, you'll find that didn't clear it completely. So at that point, I'm a big fan of using an instrument like an activator set on a medium setting and checking the motion again at the SC joint, in the proximal third of the clavicle, or all the way out at the AC joint, and using the activator, use the impulse of the instrument and doing the adjustment shifts the clavicle. And then when you have the person repeat the procedure of abduction, palms up, overhead high, down in front, you'll feel that the crepitus has either been reduced significantly or most often eliminated completely. And that's when they'll tell you that you're a genius. And again, if you'd like any more specifics on any of these adjusting techniques that we've discussed today, feel free to reach out via the website fortheloveofchiropractic.com and go to the Contact Us/comments page, and I will personally get back to you as quickly as I can. And as I stated at the beginning of this episode, obviously, there are lots of ways to clear the spine, but to do it efficiently and quickly is the key takeaway from this episode. What we didn't discuss today is table talk and getting involved in the patient's life and how you then integrate the information that they're telling you regarding their life versus the professional information that you need to share with them about how their biomechanical demands on their body are speeding up or slowing down their healing process. And we've already talked about that on some of the other episodes earlier this season. So I'll encourage you to go back and listen to those as well. All right, and that's our show for today. If you have a question about today's show or your own practice, feel free to reach out at fortheloveofchiropractic.com. Before making changes to your practice, be sure to seek legal advice regarding those changes and regulations in your state. For the Love of Chiropractic is an RGF production, all rights reserved. And thanks for listening. Original music provided by Hunter Rich Music.